Good morning. I'm Phil Brandt, President and CEO of AIM Employers Association, and welcome to This Week at Work.
This Week at Work is the only show about the workplace that offers you front row seats and a microphone, featuring experts in human resources and employment law to bring you practical, timely, and accurate insights so you can more effectively lead your organization. It's Thursday, August 10th, episode 243. Today, we talk about the value of listening to the voices available to us at work. And to listen well, as leaders, it's important to spark the right conversations by asking the right questions. Now, there's no one more qualified to help us understand what that looks like than Tanya Zion, our engagement expert. This week, Traveling Phil joins us from Indiana's SHRM conference, and Burt breaks down some news that broke just before last week's show. Shoot your questions our way and let us know what's on your mind. This Week at Work.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm happy to be back. This week, I'm coming from Indianapolis State SHRM Conference. It's been a great show so far. Quite a few people here in the heart of Indianapolis, Indiana. Some great speakers, great booths. We're having a really good time. Lots of activity at the AIM booth. Happy to be here. Burt, happy to have you back with us. And our special guest, Tanya Zion, is with us as well. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Phil. You are quite the traveler these days.
I am. And in a week, I'll be off to the Central Illinois SHRM Conference. And a week after that, I'm down to the Florida State SHRM Conference. So this is kind of a SHRM heavy month for us at AIM. And we have a great time getting to mingle with our members and picking up new things to add to our membership and make it all that much worthwhile for everyone. But I tell you what, let's go ahead and get started. Burt, let me introduce the polls. The first question of our poll today is, what is the most significant intel to learn from operational effectiveness questions? We're thinking about employee opinion and engagement surveys. You have operational effectiveness questions. What's the most significant intel you would expect to pick up from that? And then two, what is the most significant intel you would expect to pick up from leadership effectiveness? So one's focused on operation, the other one's focusing on leadership. And what would you expect to learn from those two areas? That is what we're going to zero in with Tanya Zion here in a little bit, getting a little tongue-tied. And first, we're going to kick it off with Lawyer on the Clock. Burt, are you ready?
I am ready as always, Phil.
All right, Nick, let's kick it off.
All right, it's time to look into what's trending in employment law. Lawyer, you're on the clock.
All right, so we've got much more action out of our administrative agencies, and I want to chat about that a little bit today. We've got some activities coming out of both the National Labor Relations Board and the Department of Labor, and they're really focused on trying to clamp down on anti-union activities. So in the recent weeks, both the NLRB and the Department of Labor have signaled or put into effect several pro-union initiatives. The first of these that I want to talk about is banning captive audience meetings, what are known as captive audience meetings. And when a union tries to organize a company, tries to organize a facility, one of the tools that employers have available to them is they get the opportunity to speak to their employees. After all, the company is paying the wages of these employees, and what it wants to do with those employees, so long as it's not illegal, perfectly fine. And that includes having meetings to discuss unionization. And this has been the law for the last 74 years when the United States Department of Labor decided a case way back when called Babcock and Wilcox. And in that decision, the board said that employers do not violate the act, the National Labor Relations Act, by compelling employees to attend so-called captive audience meetings and one-on-one meetings during work time to persuade them to reject unions in the workplace. So General Counsel Abruzzo has been aggressively trying to overturn this precedent. And just in recent weeks, she has issued some guidance from her office, from the General Counsel's office, that say that these meetings are illegal. In that she's going to try to take cases. She's actually got some working their way through the system now, which would say that captive audience meetings are illegal. And
Wow,
so again,
that's amazing. If that gets overruled and we go back in time, another example of times are changing for sure.
Yeah, in spite of the plain language of the National Labor Relations Act, the board's campaign against these meetings is really unwavering. And several states have also issued some laws in this area. Connecticut, Maine, Minnesota, and Oregon have outlawed captive audience meetings. New York's legislature passed a similar law in June of this year, which awaits the governor's signature. I do think the governor will sign that. And, you know, interestingly is I do think that those state laws, that is going to be preempted by the National Labor Relations Act. I don't know how those stand. They just haven't been challenged yet. But it does give you some insight as to where some of these states are going and where our current federal government is going.
It only seems fair, you know, that the employer has a chance to, you know, share its view because it has to live with the complete consequence of the outcome of an election. So it feels like that should be allowed to me, just as an individual. That people choose to make up their mind, but they should at least hear, you know, the employer's side of the story as to why they would wish to remain union free.
Yeah, this is an effort to really muzzle the employers. In a similar vein, on July 27th, the Department of Labor released a final rule that modifies their federal government LM-10 form, and that requires employers to submit when they hire consultant firms to discourage union organizing efforts. This revised form requires employers to disclose whether they are federal contractors or subcontractors. The guise of this is to promote transparency, but the rule basically says that if you have federal funds, you are not allowed to use those funds toward anti-union efforts. And so it's much more than transparency. The next one I want to talk about, and this came out the day before our broadcast last week, Bill, but I hadn't had a chance to digest it yet, but I since have had a chance to digest it. The NLRB just last week on August 2nd issued a decision called Stericycle, a case called Stericycle. And in that case, they overturned the standard established in Boeing Company for analyzing the legality of employer rules, handbooks, and policies. The board in Boeing, and that was the Trump board, had adopted a balancing test that considered two factors when evaluating a facial neutral policy, rule, or handbook. And that was number one, the nature and extent of the potential impact on National Labor Relations Act rights, and number two, the employer's legitimate justifications associated with the rule. So in the decision that was just issued in Stericycle, the board found that the Boeing board placed too little weight on the burden of a work rule on employees. They said that the purported balancing test from Boeing gave way too much weight to employer interests. It also condoned overbroad work rules by not requiring the party drafting the work rules, which of course is the employer, to narrowly tailor its rules to only promote its legitimate and substantial business interests while avoiding burdening employee rights. Okay, so this is really significant here. The board now is saying that the board needs to interpret the work rule from the perspective of, get this one, Phil, a quote unquote reasonable employee, end quote, who is economically dependent on her employer and thus inclined to interpret an ambiguous rule to prohibit protected activities. So in determining whether the rule is presumptively unlawful, the employer's intent is maintained. Intent in maintaining the rule is really immaterial. It really needs to be viewed from this reasonable employee standard to determine if an employer's rule is valid.
Well, I don't know. I think Monique might be a very reasonable employee sometimes if that becomes the standard. But I mean, that's just good luck with that, right?
Exactly.
Where is that fall in today's world of what reasonableness is?
Well, and it leaves it up to the interpretation. You could have 150 people in your organization that claim that they're a reasonable employee.
Haven't met one yet that didn't think they weren't reasonable.
Exactly.
Hey, so Burt, is there an example of a work rule that like this might affect?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of them come to mind right away. Think of like if you have a no loitering policy or an off-duty access to the premises policy where you say that employees, once they're off the clock, they need to clock out and depart the premises.
Mhm.
That would, in all likelihood, be illegal under this new standard.
Well, you and I would not be reasonable if we would assume that was reasonable.
That's right. So
Yes.
the other one that comes to mind immediately is workplace investigations. Most employers, during the course of an investigation, ask for the employees to keep the investigation itself confidential. And that's to try to make sure that there's not like tampering with witness testimony, et cetera, or witness, I'm getting into like indictments now, tampering with the witness interviews and those types of things, and also trying to tamp down on the rumor mill. That also is likely to be held invalid under this new standard. So
I don't want us to be censored like we believe we have been in the past, but isn't that kind of what they're trying to do to Trump right now? Is kind of quiet him down and hush him up by asking him to keep the facts of the case confidential?
Yeah, it kind of seems a little bit the opposite of what they're doing here with employers.
Exactly my point. Yeah.
So
it's one or the other.
We've kind of been expecting these changes to since Biden won the presidency. It's taken a long time, but here we are. So the caution for employers is, if you're in the process of reviewing your employee handbooks, you need to take a close look at your policies.
Mm-hmm.
If you aren't in that process, you probably need to start that process.
And I know both of our organizations would help you with that. Should you need any help, AIM or Ogletree is happy to help. We do tons of handbook work on both sides of our businesses, and we'll be happy to help you look after those things should you need any help.
Yep.
Anything else, Burt?
Yeah, I'll mention it really quickly, and then I'll probably give more of an update next week when we have a little bit more time. I don't want to exceed my 6 minutes by too much, Phil. And that is that I mentioned during last week's program that the EEOC confirmed has its fifth commissioner finally, which marks the first time during the Biden administration that the Democrats have had a majority at the EEOC. And they have wasted really no time since the confirmation of Kalpana-Katagal in issuing its priorities. And some of those priorities really are going to focus on things that I've talked about on this program already, which has to do with equal pay, harassment guidance, artificial intelligence bias, and protection for pregnant workers. Those are some of the top priorities for the EEOC. And last week, the chair of the commission, Charlotte Burrows, spoke to an industry group in Phoenix, and she said that she expected to see fairly soon new regulations on the new Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. I think she knew something was getting ready to hit. So just this week, the EEOC issued its proposed regulations clarifying the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Again, they're 275 pages with their preamble. I haven't made it all the way through since it just came out. But the bottom line is, and I'll give you more detail down the road, is that pregnancy needs to be treated very similarly to a disability now. That means the interactive process and the reasonable accommodation process both apply equally here as they do under the ADA.
Yeah. Okay. That does not surprise me at all with that. I do want to address, though, because there also is some compensation, fair, equal pay, and we continue to see that as a main driver into our compensation practice. Michael Makakovich, Mikey Mac, as we know him on the program, continues to help organizations assure they're ready for what might come down the line. I mean, there's many states that already have their equal pay guidelines, cities as well. But I think it's only a matter of time before the federal government defines something that says, here's what you must do. And keep in mind, if you need that space, or if you're in that space and you need some help, Mikey Mac with AIM is always available to help in that area as well. Anything else, Burt?
Nope, you made me go over my 6 minutes, Phil.
Blame it on me. That's okay. I'll take it. So let's go ahead and move on to Filbert's Forum.
You've just entered Filbert's Forum, where we peel the onion back and take a lighter look at the workplace.
All right. What do we have here, Nick? What do you got queued up for today?
Well, since we're talking about at least a portion, dimensions, I believe you call it, of the opinion and engagement surveys, I have just a couple little cartoons here I'm actually going to try voices on this because my kids don't let me use voices when I read books to them. So I'm going to do it here because nobody can stop me. I have the buttons. So here we go. This cartoon says, "Hey, this survey is totally anonymous, so write what you want." 2 days later, "Hey, Bob, why haven't you filled the survey?" How do you know I haven't? Hey, can I edit my response? There you go.
I think you better stick with video production, Nick.
I was gonna
But
say,
those are good voices. Those are good
Nick's-
voices.
Nick's got a great career ahead of him for voiceover.
All right. Well, that's exactly what we get into employee opinion and engagement surveys. And Tanya's going to talk a little bit about a segment of our surveys. But I know firsthand, people get concerned with, is the survey confidential? And when supervisors come back around and go, hey, how come you haven't filled it out? And if you are doing it internally and you can see who has and hasn't completed it, that automatically puts the organization in a position that it looks like it's big brothering versus working for the purpose of really improving the environment as it relates to engagement and so on. So Tanya, I know that becomes important when you work with employers, that element of confidentiality, people understanding the data can be trusted. It's not been manipulated. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. Any opinions that you've experienced in that with people in your focus groups or any other form of the survey?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I go with that is that's one of the advantages of using AIM because it is an outside resource that the employees have contact with as they're taking their survey. And then the other thing to think about is if you're looking at any demographic data, we're really, really careful when we set up the survey so that we don't make those demographic groups too small because we do want employees to feel confident that they can share their opinion and not feel that. And so I think that's actually, we've gotten some positive comments in the open-ended comments on surveys that they did feel like it was trustworthy. But you make a good point. We don't ever want the employee to feel like Big Brother's watching. The reason we do these surveys is to build trust, to elevate the employee voice. And if we do anything to compromise that, surveys can actually harm more than they help. And so we want to avoid that.
Yeah. And so when we do surveys, I mean, our employee opinion and engagement survey, I forget the number of questions that it's included in that. Do you know that number right offhand?
I do. It's 62 questions.
All right, 62 questions. And you break those questions down into different dimensions. So you're grouping the questions. Tell us what you're doing with that and then take us down the road of the dimensions we're going to talk about today.
Certainly. So 62 questions, a lot of times when people hear that, it feels overwhelming. And so what we try to do is we roll all of the questions up into some categories that make sense. Our highest level is read, and that's where we're looking very high level, rewards, engagement, atmosphere, and direction. And then we break that down into 10 dimensions. And the reason we do that is it makes it really easy to take the survey, right? When I'm thinking about executive leadership effectiveness, I'm going to ask questions all in around that. And it's really easy as the survey taker to answer that on that particular topic. So that's why we do that. And then compared to some of the other surveys that are out there, we actually look at a more robust look at all of the questions because it is an opinion and engagement survey. Some of the questions we are asking are really just to, what's somebody's opinion on this? But hidden within those questions are specific engagement drivers, both primary and secondary, that we can do a full analysis and say, if we're going to make change after the survey, let's focus in on these engagement drivers to really impact ROI on any actions that we would be taking.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I like the read feature that it gets broken down into. So it makes it feel very simple. Groups aren't too small, so it's hard to determine who has what response, which I know sometimes is not always what management would like. From my experience, people want to know who made this response here. But what are some of the things that you're seeing in our survey when you break it into a couple of dimensions? I know you have some data you want to share. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do with our AIM surveys is we index them back to a national norm. So all of the employer associations that use the survey, all of those answers go into an aggregate data pool that we're able to say, what's the national norm doing? And I think it's really important to do this because We want to be able to not only see what our internal for an organization year over year results are, but we also want to see what the market's doing in general when we think about employee engagement. And what we know is over the last couple of years, for the first time since we've been tracking it, employee engagement declined. That was coming out of the pandemic and some of the changes. We all know change management is hard. Like every company, if you show me a company that says, oh, we're a whiz at change management, I want to sit with you for a couple of weeks and understand your best practices. And organizations have taken on a lot of change. And so we're seeing that come out in some of the survey data points. So I pulled just national norms for 2 of our dimensions because it's what seems to be coming up a lot. The first is executive leadership effectiveness, and the second is operational effectiveness. And as you can see in this chart, there's just a sharp decline that happened coming out of 2020, and it continued to decline in 2022. Now, the good news is we are halfway through 2023. We're seeing that bounce back just a little bit. But organizations that typically their leadership fared very, very well, and they always had positive results, we're seeing that taking a steep decline. And additionally, what I'm talking to members about every single day is that operational effectiveness. What are your processes like? How is that working?
I mean, these are some significant declines in the national norms. And if I remember correctly, in that 2020 timeframe, right as we were going into the COVID pause, those were some of the highest results we have seen ever in our normative data. And then it has taken a steep decline, and I know it will be a slow rebuild. Do you think there's a connection to what I'll call the new workplace now? There's all kinds of misdirection of working from home and flexibility and part-time in the office. And when I'm in the office, people aren't in the office. Do you think there's a connection to that, or with the work that you've done, is it telling you something different?
I think the key piece of all of this, and I have to boil it down to the root cause, is really, do you know your stakeholders? And a lot of what happened in the last couple of years is we've replaced high-level management, we've replaced mid-level management, and maybe we haven't paused to do the work to really form those team charters. Do my managers know one another? Do I know what my counterpart in a different department is truly responsible for? And so when we get the feedback on operational effectiveness and we see this dip, I think that we have lost some of our process. And what happened over the last couple of years is, if I'm responsible for accounting, I just got accounting done. It needed to get done. I'm going to do it. And what I may have forgotten to do was check in with my counterparts and my stakeholders to say, how does this change impact you? And that's what employees are telling us. We're doing repetitive work. We're doing work that doesn't make sense. I don't have the information I need. And the employees are kind of on the front line of all of that. And so those changes that didn't get managed well, they're going to tell you about it. And I think we're seeing that reflected in these 2 categories, especially.
You think there's a coincidence that these 2 mirror each other almost in their shape?
I don't. I don't at all. I think a lot of times if an operation doesn't work well, who are you going to blame, right? Who are you going to point to? Because ultimately, if I'm the head of the organization, I'm responsible for this.
Right.
And quite often, executive leadership is the only one in a position to make a change, right? I may really like my supervisor, but I see that we're wasting time. And as a result, we are not giving good quality to our customers. And so what I think is really encouraging is we have this section on our survey, because the employees have a different vantage point than we'll ever be able to have as executives. And so the willingness to weigh in on this and talk about it, I think, is important.
I just wanted to comment real quickly. First of all, I think that's a wonderful chart that you put together there. Don't want to let that go without any recognition. It's, I think what you bring up is really, you can analogize it to what we see going on in sports all the time. And that is that when a team is underperforming, who's one of the first people to get blamed for the underperformance? It's either the manager or the coach. And it may not be fair a lot of times, but the bottom line is that, it's the buck stops with somebody. And it stops generally with that top leadership. I'm looking at your chart, and I always like to joke with people. I'm like, can anyone tell when COVID hit? And that's that huge downward slope in pretty much any chart you look at during the time of COVID. But what's interesting to me is that flip-flop that you see in 2023 with operational effectiveness and executive leadership effectiveness sort of flip-flopping there, where for the first time in your chart, it looks like executive leadership effectiveness can still be decent, but that doesn't necessarily translate into operational effectiveness. What do you think that switch is attributable to?
I think a couple of things. So whenever I go in and talk to members, I always talk about consulting with three legs, right? It's process, people, and communication, and how those overlap. And so depending on what's happening in the organization, some people are happy, right? If you have a hybrid workplace, if you have some of those things and things have started to settle in where now it's like, okay, we see you're moving us in the right direction, but we still haven't worked out all of the things that I'm hearing sometimes. I think we've also understood the importance of communication. When everything went down, like in the 2021, especially, we saw this drop off when people were responding, because what happened when we sent everybody home? We talked to our employees daily, right? We gave updates weekly. We talked to them all the time. And then as things normalized, what happened is we stopped communicating. And so in the organizations that I am, and I think it's interesting based on what you talked about earlier, there is a certain level of transparency around this is what we're trying to achieve. This is how we're doing that. And when I go into organizations where they're talking often, then we do see the scores be a little bit better. So not specifically, I don't have an exact answer for this chart, but I know there's some best practices where we see those scores come back up.
You know, the other thing that comes to mind when I look at it is right at that same time, we started to have the squeeze on the workforce. And right following that, we had, you know, the Great Resignation. We started to hearing about that as we came out of COVID. And there has been a tremendous amount of retirement and resignation and promoting from within, and the whole idea of being able to train and develop people as quickly as that movement has occurred has almost been impossible for some organizations. And they struggle even today, you know, to say, well, it's hard for me to have a supervisor or a manager or a director who's new in their position, maybe has not led people before, leave and be away for a day and receive 1 day worth of training, 8 hours of training to lead on behalf of an organization. And that definitely will have an effect, because many of the people leaving those positions who have retired have been through years of development, whether it was trial and error or professional development. They've been there before, done that. And now we have a bunch of new people who are, you know, going through the learning curve. And it's really up to organizations to invest in that group of people to, you know, eliminate the dip as it comes to that.
Do you know what's so interesting about that, Phil, though, is I think we have this period of time where there's empathy because people know that their supervisor hasn't had a lot of training or they're new. And I think we really need to get ahead of that as employers, because that window, I think, is closing. And so there's sort of this disconnect, because on most of the surveys, I should have added this to my chart, the supervisor effectiveness is actually higher than the executive leadership. And I think that's just proximity. Mm-hmm. Look, this person's down in the trenches, they know what we've been through, and then it's easy to reach out and say, but the executive team needs to do something about it. And that's where we come back to, you know, we don't have good documentation. And when we have a lot of turnover or we absorb a lot of changes, is it time to do some org development, right? Yeah. People are wearing so many hats. Do we need to take a step back? And in our 2024 strategic planning, do we really need to look at what org development needs to be, not only in terms of positions we have, but also when we talk about advancement through the organization?
Yeah, when we're talking about organizational development today, it's very dynamic, and not everyone's coming into the same place, following the same rules. Burt was just telling us all these challenges that we're having. We can't let people loiter around the office after they're done because, you know, there's going to be government agencies that don't like that. We have new supervisors, we have new people, we have people in all different parts of the country working, you know, for your employer, and it's just a very dynamic challenge. So, you know, I feel like there's a lot to discuss. I wish we had more time in that, Tanya, but thank you so much for bringing that to light. That is something that every employer should be aware of, is where do we stand? Because if we know where we stand, we can do something about it. And that's what I encourage all employers to do. AIM provides great resources. It's part of your membership benefit. If that's something that you're interested in, we can get you aligned with Tanya and start a conversation and let her help you move your organization forward. All right. Anything else from you, Burt or Tanya, before we go?
I have one positive thing because you guys say I'm
Okay.
an optimist, and that is it is very lonely at the top, but you also make incredible impact. So yes, there's a lot of challenges right now, but what you come in and do every day matters. And so don't give up hope because you're creating a place of identity, a place of purpose for your employees, and that can't be overstated in what we do in the workplace.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I've just spent several days here with 1,500 HR professionals who love that message. Tanya, thank you for that. All right, we will be back here next week at 7:30 Central Time. We will see you then. Until then, go out, be positive, and be good to people. Bye-bye.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link aimea.org/thisweekatwork or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.